The plague was one of the biggest killers of the Middle Ages. It had a devastating effect on the population of Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. Also known as the Black Death, the plague, caused by the bacterium called Yersinia pestis, was carried by fleas most often found on rats. It had arrived in Europe by 1348, and thousands died in places ranging from Italy, France and Germany to Scandinavia, England, Wales, Spain and Russia. The deadly bubonic plague caused oozing, swellings, buboes, all over the body. With the septicemic plague, victims suffered from skin that was darkly discolored, turning black, as a result of toxins in the bloodstream, one reason why the plague has subsequently been called the Black Death. Extremely contagious pneumonic plague could be contracted by merely sneezing or spitting, and caused victims' lungs to fill up. The Black Death killed between a third and half of the population of Europe. Contemporaries did not know, of course, what caused the plague or how to avoid catching it. They sought explanations for the crisis in God's anger, human sin, and outsider, marginal groups, especially Jews. If you were infected with the bubonic plague, you had a 70 to 80% chance of dying within the next week. In England, out of every 100 people, perhaps 35 to 40 could expect to die from the plague. As a result of the plague, life expectancy in late 14th century Florence was just under 20 years, half of what it had been in 1300. From the mid-14th century onwards, thousands of people from all across Europe, from London and Paris to Ghent, Mainz and Siena, died. A large number of those were children, who were the most vulnerable to the disease. Dying man dictating his will. Miniature from the Codex Justinianus, codification of imperial constitutions written by Byzantine Emperor Justinian I c.482–565, 1350. Biblioteca Malatestiana Library, Cesena, Italy, photo by Limage, UIG. People in the medieval period faced a host of potential dangers when traveling. A safe, clean place to sleep upon demand was difficult to find. Travelers often had to sleep out in the open. When traveling during the winter, they ran the risk of freezing to death. And while traveling in groups provided some safety, one still might be robbed or killed by strangers, or even one's fellow travelers. Nor were food and drink provided unless the traveler had found an inn, monastery, or other lodging. Food poisoning was a risk even then, and if you ran out of food, you had to forage, steal, or go hungry. Medieval travelers could also be caught up in local or regional disputes or warfare, and be injured or thrown into prison. Lack of knowledge of foreign tongues could also lead to problems of interpretation. Illness and disease could also be dangerous, and even fatal. If one became unwell on the road, there was no guarantee that decent, or indeed any, medical treatment could be received. Travelers might also fall victim to accident. For example, there was a risk of drowning when crossing rivers. Even the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick I, drowned in 1190 when crossing the Salif River during the Third Crusade. Accidents might also happen upon arrival. In Rome during the 1450 Jubilee, disaster struck when some 200 people in the huge crowd crossing the Great Bridge of San Angelo tumbled over the edge and drowned. While it was faster to travel by sea than land, stepping onto a boat presented substantial risks. A storm could spell disaster, or navigation could go awry, and the medieval wooden ships used were not always equal to the challenges of the sea. However, by the later Middle Ages, sea travel was becoming faster and safer than ever before. An average traveler in the medieval period could expect to cover 15 to 25 miles a day on foot or 20 to 30 on a horse, while sailing ships might make 75 to 125 miles a day. Famine was a very real danger for medieval men and women. Faced with dwindling food supplies due to bad weather and poor harvests, people starved or barely survived on meager rations like bark, berries and inferior corn and wheat damaged by mildew. Those eating so little suffered malnutrition, and were therefore very vulnerable to disease. If they didn't starve to death, they often died as a result of the epidemics that followed famine. Illnesses like tuberculosis, sweating sickness, smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, influenza, mumps and gastrointestinal infections could indeed kill. The Great Famine of the early 14th century was particularly bad. Climate change led to much colder than average temperatures in Europe from C-130, the Little Ice Age. In the 7 years between 1315 and 1322, Western Europe witnessed incredibly heavy rainfall for up to 150 days at a time. Farmers struggled to plant, grow and harvest crops. Meager crops did grow were often mildewed, and/or terribly expensive. The main food staple, bread, was in peril as a result. This also came at the same time as brutally cold winter weather. At least 10%, perhaps close to 15%, of people in England died during this period. Today, with the benefits of ultrasound scans, epidurals and fetal monitoring, the risk for mother and baby during pregnancy and childbirth is at an all-time low. However, during the medieval period, giving birth was incredibly perilous. Breech presentations of the baby during labor often proved fatal for both mother and child. Labor could go on for several days, and some women eventually died of exhaustion. While caesarean sections were known, they were unusual other than when the mother of the baby was already dead or dying, and they were not necessarily successful. Midwives, rather than trained doctors, usually attended pregnant women. They helped the mother to be during labor and, if needed, were able to perform emergency baptisms on babies in danger of dying. Most had received no formal training, but relied on practical experience gleaned from years of delivering babies. New mothers might survive the labor, but could die.